Well, here on Outsiders, back in April, we started talking about the Swedish experiment with coronavirus. The fact that the Swedes decided to rely on basic, common sense social distancing measures, plus, of course, not mandating lockdowns in order to let the economy survive. We had Dr. Johan Giesecke here talking us, a Swedish epidemiologist, who said it was pointless to try and defeat the virus through lockdowns. Well, has it worked or has it not worked? I'm delighted to say we have here exclusively on Outsiders, Dr. Sebastian Rushworth. You can find him on his blog, sebastianrushworth.com. He is a Swedish doctor. He's going to tell us right from the coalface exactly what has happened in Sweden. Doctor, welcome to Outsiders.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Rushworth, just tell us a bit about your practice and your experience with the coronavirus over the last few months in Stockholm.
Okay, so I work in the emergency room of one of the big hospitals in Stockholm, and I would say before COVID hit Sweden, I was vaguely aware of it, but wasn't really tracking it. I knew that something was happening in Italy and in Korea. Then we started to get reports of a few cases coming into Sweden, and I heard they were being quarantined. There was contact tracing going on, and then pretty much from one day to the next, it became very clear that the disease was exploding in Stockholm, and that the best we could hope for was to slow the spread, mainly to spare the healthcare system from being overwhelmed. Basically, from one day to the next, we went from a situation where we were dealing with the normal patients in the emergency room, heart attacks, kidney stones, and the next day, all those patients were mystically gone and had been replaced with COVID patients. And for the next month or so, we were dealing just with COVID and nothing else.
And dealing with COVID, to what degree, how serious were the COVID patients? What measures did you take?
Well, most of the patients weren't that serious. It was, COVID for most people is like, I guess, like a mild respiratory illness, a cold. For some people, it's like the flu, and for a minority of patients, usually people who are older and sicker, it can be much more severe, with the severe respiratory distress. And so, we were seeing the whole spectrum of patients for a while there. And then after about a month or so, things started to taper off, and they've been tapering off ever since. Like I write in my blog, I haven't seen a single COVID patient in more than 6 weeks now.
So this is fascinating, Doctor. So Sweden had about 6,000 deaths all up, a population of 10 million. You're now saying you're seeing no COVID patients. You haven't seen any COVID patients for 6 weeks, and you're right there in the heart of Stockholm.
In the emergency room, I'm not seeing any COVID patients. And as far as I know right now, there isn't a single COVID patient being treated in the hospital I work in either.
And what do you put this down to?
My personal guess is that we've reached a point where enough people have been infected that we've reached a state of herd immunity. That's the only reasonable explanation I can find.
Rita.
Now, Sweden, if it has achieved herd immunity, will be very pleased, but it hasn't come easy. You've got one of the highest death rates per capita in the world, less than the UK, Italy and Spain, but still well in the top 10. What's your response to that you've sacrificed a lot of elderly people to pursue this herd immunity strategy?
I really think it depends on what the goal of lockdown is. I can't deny that our neighbors, Denmark, Norway, Germany, Finland, they've been much more effective than Sweden at locking down their societies, because they've actually tried to do it. We haven't put anywhere near the effort that they have into it, and they have a few hundred deaths compared with with Sweden having a couple thousand. So in that sense, they've been effective. I just think you have to look at what are you trying to accomplish over the longer term. To me, the only situation where it really makes sense to lock down society completely is if you're willing to stay in complete lockdown until the vaccine is available.
Do you think in the long run, Sweden's death rate is going to be similar to its neighbours? That though your death rate has been far higher, you've now not having many infections while your neighbours are still don't have that herd immunity. Do you think most countries are all going to end up with similar death rates before a vaccine, if a vaccine is made available?
That would be my guess, unless those countries are willing to stay in lockdown for another year.
James.
So I'm just wondering, to what do you attribute this herd immunity? Because they say that you need 50, 60, 70% of people with antibodies, but I've read that you say that T cells are actually the key to this, but we don't test for them like we do antibodies. So what do you attribute this herd immunity to? Is it T cells? How do we know? And ultimately, what do you think the infection fatality rate for this winds up being if you have achieved this herd immunity, and what are the implications for that?
It's true, herd immunity requires 50, 60, 70% of the population to become infected. But it doesn't necessarily require 50, 60, 70% to have antibodies. And I think there are interesting studies coming out now that show that a lot of people who have been infected are developing T cell responses, even though they're not necessarily developing an antibody response. And the preliminary evidence suggests that T cell response can be quite enough to allow a person to be immune. I know that everyone who works in the emergency room where I work has been tested for antibodies, and very few of us actually have antibodies, maybe 10, 20%. In spite of that, we're not getting sick, even though we're seeing COVID patients every single day. Or at least we were when the pandemic was at its peak.
So, Sebastian, tell us two things. What did you make of the debate surrounding whether people have died with COVID versus died of COVID, and how did that affect you in your emergency rooms? And also just tell us a bit about what daily life is now like in Sweden. Has the fear gone? The shops are open, it's summer, people are having a great time. Does anyone even talk about COVID?
I think it could definitely be the case that people are dying with COVID rather than from COVID. If a person has a positive test, I think there is definitely a certain likelihood that they will be diagnosed as having died of COVID, even if they actually died of something else and just happened to have COVID at the same time.
Has that skewed the numbers? Has that changed the numbers? Do you think it's pushed them higher than they would otherwise be?
It's possible. That could be one explanation for why New York, for example, seems to have a much higher death rate than Sweden. My guess would be that maybe they're overdiagnosing. And then to your second question, COVID, when I'm traveling in the tube is packed now. 3 months ago, it was empty. No one's wearing masks. People are going to cafes and restaurants. If you read the daily newspapers, often there's no sign of COVID on the front page. So I think most people are really putting it behind them at this point.
Well, Dr. Sebastian Rushworths, what fascinating insights from Sweden there. People can read your blog. I urge them to go to sebastianrushworth.com, read more about what is really going on in Sweden, because, Sebastian, here we can't escape the headlines about COVID. They're on every bloody page. So there you go. We're living a very different reality to yours. Thank you so much for sharing your insights about Sweden and the great work you do in the emergency room there. Thank you so much for coming on Outsiders.
Thank you.